The story about Donald Trump's Consolation Peace Prize participation trophy that we brought you at the top of the show, really, you had to see it to believe it. You can go look up the whole thing. It was one of the most surreal spectacles of the second Trump term. I felt like I was hallucinating. I mean, you got the President of the United States, he's walking the red carpet and pretending like he doesn't know he's going to get this fake prize that was specially made for him. One that the soccer conglomerate FIFA made up specifically for him as a way of ingratiating themselves, because everyone understands, like, you got to give the guy prizes and gifts and gold. And then shuffling across a lengthy stage to meet FIFA's president with sort of grave solemnity and accept his important peace prize. The most indelible image is arguably this one of the president theatrically pulling his medal out of its case before immediately putting it on, surprising the head of FIFA. Like, look how proud, he can't wait. Look how proud he is. Look how proud he is of his little gold medal. Today's proceedings came as new reporting indicated the president is privately raging at news coverage of his aging and apparent mental decline, and certainly any comparisons being made of him to Sleepy Joe. Although I have to say, to his credit today, it seems he did manage to stay awake for the ceremony. Aspen Subsang is a senior political correspondent for Zateo, who's reported on Trump's fury at the coverage of his decline. Donna Edwards, a former Democratic congresswoman of Maryland, and they join me now. So, I want you to talk a little bit about your reporting that you had about the fact that the coverage of Trump's, whatever you want to call it, age, mental state, propensity to doze off while someone is speaking about and to him merely 7 or 8 inches away, that he doesn't like the coverage of that's getting under his skin. What did you learn?
Well, I think on the public level, never mind the behind-the-scenes elements of that, which I'll get to in just a moment, but publicly, you can tell how incensed this president and this White House are when the media even gently points out on occasion that why is this guy falling asleep so routinely during public meetings? Why is his stamina not what it once was? Why is there evidence of what some people may even call cognitive or health decline? And if you talk to people who are very close to this president, whether they work in the administration or close to it, they will tell you, besides the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, there are fewer things that enrage him more on a visceral level than if you bring up to him or if he sees media coverage of his, shall we say, declining state. This has gotten to a point where senior officials in the administration have instructed underlings, fellow officials, media surrogates to keep reminding the public about his alleged rigor and energy and stamina. They have used the words stamina, stamina, stamina over and over again when they're encouraging their allies in the media and elsewhere to stick up for him. So this is something that has clearly gotten under his skin, largely because we have reached a breaking point when it comes to the national mainstream and legacy media, where it seems that there's a deluge of coverage of this. It's the New York Times, it's the Washington Post, it's CNN, it's all these different outlets that he really cares about and detests that cannot get around the fact that Sleepy Joe Biden has been replaced by Sleepy Donald Trump. And they are giving it the amount of coverage that it deserves, which unfortunately is a large amount.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to ignore when someone's falling asleep in the middle of a live televised event. You really don't see that a lot. It's really hard to ignore when it's the president. And Donna, of course, the thing that is, I think, haunts this entire discourse, particularly for Democrats, right, is that this was the central issue of the 2024 campaign before Joe Biden dropped out. It was the reason that Joe Biden dropped out after the debate performance. There's a range of opinions people have about how justified that was or not. But what was certainly the case was Joe Biden was advanced in age. He was the oldest man to hold the presidency. And it was also evident to everyone back in 2024 that if elected, he would be supplanted in that role by Donald Trump. And yet somehow that reality was not allowed to penetrate in the campaign in the same way that Joe Biden's age was.
Well, I mean, I think part of this is because sometimes, especially in public events, the way the president presents himself at rallies, on stage, when the, camera's on, he's standing up and he's, boxing and, dancing weirdly on stage. And it looks like he presents himself as vigorous, but the photographs and the videos speak for themselves. It doesn't matter how many times his spokespeople say the word stamina. if you've got video evidence that this guy is falling asleep, he's falling asleep. And so I think it's tough to refute that. And it does kind of get into the craw, I think, of Democrats, given that I can't remember times that Joe Biden was routinely caught sleeping when heads of state are around in cabinet meetings. And this president routinely does that. And, and I think it does stick with people that it was a thing that was attached to Joe Biden, maybe probably because of the nickname. But clearly, we've got a sleepy Donald Trump.
Yeah, and there's also, it also does seem like there are genuine health questions. I think there would be with, again, anyone of this age, Swin, and I know that they're so clearly defensive about that. But again, as with so many things, Swin, nothing they do, none of the statements can be found to be reassuring in any way, because it's all this North Korean style propaganda about how he can play 36 rounds of golf and has the greatest human heart that anyone's ever seen.
There are roughly $1 billion plus. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I think at this point it's gotten significantly more. If you tabulate it up, dedicated since January 2025, shoveled in by the federal government in public taxpayer dollars to try to make Donald Trump feel good about himself. There is a sprawling network of programs that you and I are paying for right now with our tax dollars that the federal government is using to make the so-called Emperor Trump feel very good about himself, make him feel like he is the coolest, greatest, most strongest president and leader of the free world there's ever been. And that has not stopped at all when it comes to him essentially instructing his White House and chief lieutenants throughout his administration and political party that they need to constantly tell the American people over and over and over and again that this guy is not declining in any way. And if you think so, you're fake news. Now, the problem is most observers and most voters have eyes and ears
are able to see him
successfully to their brain.
Donna, that spectacle today, I have to say, I couldn't stop watching, but my level of secondhand embarrassment surpassed anything I think I've ever seen with something involving Donald Trump. It was really a sight to behold.
Well, this was a SNL skit that just wrote itself from the very beginning. And the fact that he couldn't wait for, the Infantino to place the medal around him and he took it out of the box and put it on himself. First of all, it was very undignified, but it's a made up trophy. It is the T-ball. Everybody gets a peace trophy. And I think so many people, and Infantino joins the line of people over and over again who think that they can butter up this president in these kind of ways in order to, gain his attention, his satisfaction, to feed his ego. And this award today was no different from that. And it was, I was so embarrassed. I really had to grab myself because I was embarrassed for him.
Yes, I was too. Aswan Subsang, Donna Edwards, thank you both.
Begin with something that began serious, involves a tragedy, and now is a full-blown catastrophe on multiple levels for the Trump administration and also the United States Pentagon. There are clouds clearly gathering around Pentagon Chief Hegseth, and we are getting the new details, which is partly a bad thing. There's a problem here, and most people see that the government has a problem. But there's also transparency, accountability, and even bipartisan pressure at work, something that Donald Trump, on his worst autocratic days, has tried to argue, claim, or pretend doesn't happen anymore. That he could be, as some of the protesters say, a king not subject to oversight. And yet here we are dealing with matters of life and death and war, and the oversight is, in a way, working because we're learning things. Doesn't mean we're in the clear. I'm not telling you this is all fixed and some of the lives lost are lost for good. But that brings me to how we are basically ending this week with some chilling new details about the deadly strike that, according to legal experts and many veterans who work in this space, appears on its face from the video evidence to constitute a war crime committed by the United States under the Trump administration. There are serious questions about the two shipwrecked survivors of what was that first attack and whether once they were survivors, right? That's the term of art in law and combat. We've all heard about having survivors of war and having detainees. If you think back, and you're not a legal expert, why do we have so many discussions about detainees, even in the greatest wars, the World War II or the so-called War on Terror, where we were told these terrorists were terrible, and they were, but if they were caught alive, we followed the rules, the Geneva Conventions. You can think of examples where we didn't, and those were multi-year scandals. But in general, we have detainees, we have survivors of war, enemy combatants, and the rest, because we don't execute everyone. I say that as the baseline to remind you why this is such a big deal. The September 2nd attack involved on video the apparent killing or execution of those shipwreck survivors. Now we're getting more reporting about the video evidence. The New York Times, this came late today, says a new detail about the survivors of a U.S. military strike on a boat in the Caribbean further complicates the military's explanations for launching that, quote, follow-up attack that killed them. That is, of course, the strike that is sometimes proverbially referred to this week as the second strike. Quote, multiple people who've seen video of the attacks say the survivors climbed on the overturned hull and waved to something overhead, a gesture interpreted as an attempt to surrender, beckoning rescue, or trying to signal other alleged drug traffickers. You can see there the debate about what the signal meant and whether they were a threat or not. Now, the Times reports some who viewed the video said the most logical explanation was that the two survivors had seen the American aircraft above them and started signaling for a rescue. It's not clear from the video what the survivors had definitely seen the American aircraft, whether or not they had. All of this adding to the accounts from lawmakers who, of course, are putting on this bipartisan pressure, which is why so quickly some information, video, and testimony has come out. They were able to view what the United States military under the Trump administration is still not releasing, the video of the second attack. And they said the survivors, according to some lawmakers, appeared to be trying to flip the remnants of their boat. One lawmaker recounting there was no boat, there was wreckage. Again, by the way, I'll leave this quote up, but that's why we've heard this described by some credible sources as shipwreck survivors, not exactly people running a functioning vessel at that point. Continuing the quote, there was no radio. There were two guys clinging to a tiny, non-awash portion of the keel of a capsized boat. It would be important if there was no radio or international signaling process, right? Audio or I guess perhaps something else in the water. But if there's no radio and no signaling, then, well, that's going to affect what they were able to do and the argument or explanation that some around the Pentagon have offered that maybe they were still communicating and thus some type of threat. There was this classified briefing from Admiral Bradley, who oversaw these strikes under Pentagon Chief Hegseth. Again, reading from the reporting of the New York Times journalists, quote, amid preparations for the briefing, U.S. officials told the Times they had been told one of the survivors had radioed for help. But the people said remarks from Admiral Bradley about communications were instead purely speculative. The reason for the disconnect was not clear. You'll notice that word from the Times, disconnect. That is diplomatic. And as I've reported and serious people have mentioned, this is a process story. This is not a story where you know everything that happened. But if disconnect turns into cover-up or lies about an alleged war crime, well, the Trump administration's problems are going to increase, not decrease. There is bipartisan pressure, but there also, as some of the material has started coming out, a split. We've often seen that in congressional politics. Some of the Democrats say it's very clear what they saw on video.
First of all, we need to be clear. There was no fog of war. They had a clear vision of these two people on top of what was left of their capsized boat for quite a while. I saw Senator Cotton say that the two gentlemen were trying to turn their boat back up, I guess. That is patently ridiculous. That boat wasn't going anywhere.
Anybody who sees that video would have real questions about whether the United States is abiding by the values that distinguish us around the world.
There are questions about why the Trump administration is holding back the video of the second strike. If the videos here are part of an important investigative review of these warlike actions from an administration that says it has wartime powers, from immigration to bombing vessels that aren't part of a country we're at war with, then surely the oversight of this non-war lethal activity can include all the video, not just some that is selectively released. We have video, of course, from the first strike. administration does release strike videos. Indeed, at times, it is strike videos that this, and to be fair, some other administrations have touted to show the might of the American military, and even some argue the deterrent effect of showing enemies, be they in boats with contraband and drugs, or worse, terrorists and foreign fighters, look what the U.S. can do. Now, suddenly, this video-first policy is being held back when it comes to the second strike. Trump, though, has claimed there'd be no problem with releasing video of the second strike.
Will you release video of that strike so that the American people can see for themselves what happened?
I don't know what they have, but whatever they have, we'd certainly release. No problem.
There is an echo here of so many other things with this president. We'll release the Epstein files, except they've been in his control the whole time and he hasn't released them. You go back to the first term. I have no problem talking to Bob Mueller, but he never did. Donald Trump is, if nothing else, very good at keeping an eye on the PR and the headlines he wants. And while I think some of the press has wised up over time, and certainly some of the public, if you look at the reaction to Donald Trump's misleading statements about high inflation or prices, just to pick a very different issue, plenty of the public has wised up to this. What he's seeking, what you won't see on our headline right now, you see we're talking about Pentagon Chief Hegseth under fire, but he is, just as a political and public relations matter, according to the past evidence, he's seeking headlines that say he's fine with the release, just like he got headlines about being fine with talking to Mueller. Well, the buck stops with the leadership, in this case, the Pentagon chief and the president. And if they want the video out, it should be out. And every day that it goes by and it's not out, that buck stops at the president's desk, where his secrecy problem stretches from his own past dealings with Epstein, which has a looming deadline this month, of course, to whatever his administration's currently doing with Epstein's co-conspirator, giving her lenient treatment, to whatever's going on in this video, and a heck of a lot of other stuff, crypto, corruption allegations about deals they've cut relating to war and Russia. There's a lot of secrecy. And that makes you wonder, what are they hiding? And in our skeptical internet era, a heck of a lot more people, including on the center and the center right, maybe not pure loyal MAGA, but a heck of a lot more people are not naturally just trusting the government, telling them on any of the issues I just mentioned, including this strike, trust us, you don't need to see the evidence with your own eyes. Here's what one military lawyer said. It's hard to see any argument that the follow-up strike was lawful unless one accepts a series of premises. That the U.S. is in a war with drug traffickers. That's that claimed wartime power I mentioned earlier that Congress hasn't declared. Quote, a broad array of legal analysts dispute the idea that we would just be in a endless actual drug war. Second, that the two survivors were on board a seaworthy vessel and not at risk of drowning. That the drugs in the boat itself were military objects. Stack that all up and you have something more like a law school exam hypothetical, something much closer to that than the actual legal justification for some of what you see on your screen. Now, the Pentagon continues to carry out strikes. They did a new one late Thursday night. The total number of these strikes is over 20 estimated, and they have killed 86 people. Remember, a whole bunch of people are getting killed by this process, which we now see is, at a minimum, convoluted, and at a maximum, a potential war crime. That's the state of play, with a heck of a lot of secrecy. And the Pentagon chief under fire to a degree that Donald Trump, who used to fire people for fake on TV, his fake firing, his Apprentice show, but lately hasn't shown the ability to demand any accountability and remove people in his administration, despite some of these documented problems.
Yeah, it's highly problematic, to say the least, that Dan Bongino now gets to be in the proverbial room where it happens and has discovered inconvenient truths. The truth being that there was no conspiracy to suppress the actual identity of the alleged pipe bomber, but rather it seems like this was more garden variety inability to connect dots, the sort of thing that our colleague Ken Dilanian has said has been a problem for the FBI for decades, and not just a function of an administration on which Mr. Bongino and some of his allies now want to sort of foist that problem on a single administration. Look, Michael, at the very least, the most generous interpretation of what Dan Bongino said was, I have evolved, I learned the truth, And now I understand that the things that I peddled as opinion are no longer true. The question I have is, if that was conspiracy theory and this is the truth, what happens when a former conspiracy theorist starts telling truths? Sometimes people don't want to believe those truths. So when, for example, Dan Bongino now says to the American people from behind the door of being the deputy FBI director that in light of now what he's seen, there is nothing else to investigate about, for example, Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and their web of sex trafficking. Who believes that, given all of the conspiracies that Dan Bongino helped to perpetuate when he was an opinion maker and not a law enforcement officer?
Well, Simone, he did go on to say, just to that point, that when he goes back to the private sector, he intends to pick up where he left off.
And the performance is the problem. You know, the pipe bomber actually confessed that he believed the election conspiracies. He saw himself acting in defense of Donald Trump. And I didn't see any remorse from Dan Bongino, Pam Bondi, or Kash Patel at that podium the other day. Because the reality of the situation is, and maybe I view this differently because I was at the DNC that day that the bombs were there. I was with the vice president-elect. The bombs outside the RNC and the DNC were real. Real people were working in those offices. The intent of these bombs were to inflict harm and potentially kill people. What would have happened if the bombs went off outside that building? I think about that every single day. I remember sitting in the conference room of the Democratic National Committee because the vice president-elect wanted to watch the ballots, the certification ballots being carried across the floor before we had some recording to actually do. And she's like, I want to watch the ballots. We're sitting in the conference room watching these ballots being brought across, and Secret Service bursts into the room and says, we have to leave. There is a bomb outside of this building. Y'all know me, a bomb. Even in times of heroin, I found a bomb. He's like, a bomb. We have to get out. I'm looking for my purse. The vice president-elect of the United States could have been killed that day. I don't think we talk about it enough like that. So the conspiracy theories that folks like Dan Bongino, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, and the president of the United States perpetuated, they have real consequences.
Yeah, and it's clear that Bongino is struggling to square his previous positions with the reality of this case. Now, credit where it's due. I don't give a lot of credit to these guys often, so I want to give credit now. They actually arrested somebody that didn't fit the narrative that Bongino was, pushing before he came into office. The problem is, it's the quote that he was just giving. It's not just that he was paid for his, opinions in the past. He says that he's going to go back to the media after this. He considers himself not really a law enforcement officer, but a media figure. And that means that he's going to struggle to, take actions that are contrary to his public positions. He was able to do it once, but given the backlash they've already experienced, is he going to be able to do it again?
It's
Alicia, what do these people even believe?
I do appreciate, Simone, whenever you talk about that experience, because I agree that it is really easy to lose sight of the ways in which this could have played out and what the stakes actually were. And it is interesting, Brendan Ballou, to hear you give credit to this DOJ, given the number of times you have come on this program and critiqued them, and given the side-by-side of this investigation with what we are watching play out with the president go after some of his loudest critics. There is some new news in the Letitia James case, a court document in which the judge appears to confirm MS Now reporting of the failure to indict A.G. James. After review, the grand jury failed to concur in issuing the proposed indictment and returned a no true bill. Lisa, you have been following this, and there are some ways in which this is particularly unusual.
Yes, and I want to say, first of all, this is a public document, but it doesn't say anything about Letitia James's name on it. However, given the rarity statistically of no bills and the fact that it would be highly, highly statistically anomalistic for there to have been another no bill in Norfolk, Virginia yesterday, one can reasonably come to the conclusion that it appears that this judge, Trask in Norfolk, Virginia, is talking about the effort to re-indict Letitia James. What's unusual here, Alicia, is oftentimes, and I hesitate to say often because a no bill is not an often event, but when a no bill comes back from a grand jury, meaning they refuse to indict, usually there's no public record of it. And here the magistrate judge has put in a new public filing the fact that the no bill was obtained, but also said he has directed the court clerk to take the proposed indictment against Letitia James, put it under seal alongside a record of how the grand jury voted. The fact that this judge is even acknowledging that there was a grand jury proceeding yesterday, much less a no bill, is highly unusual. I spoke tonight to a former magistrate judge with 15 years experience on the bench. That judge told me he had seen zero no true bills in their experience on the bench, and in their prior experience as a federal prosecutor, had encountered that exactly once and was positive that there was no public record of that ever happening. So you have to ask yourself, why is this judge wanting to make a record of that? Perhaps to signal to both the Department of Justice and to Letitia James's legal team, these documents are there. And if they succeed in obtaining an indictment against her on a third try, someone could potentially move to unseal them because they need them in her defense.
It is an amazing turn of events out here with that right now, Brendan, where you, given everything we're talking about, the one thing that really cuts me with respect to the individual arrested in the pipe bombing situation is that he was a J6er. He was there that evening, that week, and participating, however, and there's more facts and evidence that are going to come out to that. But here's the thing that I chew on. You hear this press by the administration, we got him, we're going to prosecute him, we're going to go after him. My question is, Donald Trump, when are you going to pardon him? Because if you caught him 2-3 days after the pipe bomb, he would have been in the whole booking class that just went through the system and were convicted, and you pardoned. So all of the bravado, Brendan, that I'm hearing from this administration about convicting this individual and we got him and we're doing that sort of macho yippee-ki-yay crap that they like to do. My question is, when does he get his pardon? Because his comrades in arms have all gotten a free walk for their crimes. So this administration prosecuting them sounds a little bit suspect to me.
Well, one of the first arguments that his defense counsel is presumably going to make is that the pardon for the original January 6 defendants applies to this guy too. Because that was written so broadly.
Yes, it was.
It was for all events related to the Capitol on January 6, 2021. This was an event related to the Capitol on January 6. So they're going to argue that it applies. But to your point, I've always seen the January 6 pardons as, it's not just the effect, but the intention was to empower people who were enacting violence in Donald Trump's name and putting them beyond the reach of the law. So it would be entirely consistent with them either, trying to apply the current pardon to him or perhaps seeking a new pardon. To be extremely blunt, however, there are two things that distinguish this defendant. One is, most of the recent people who have been pardoned by the president have been extremely wealthy. This guy presumably is not. And I hate to go there, but bluntly, the overwhelming number of people that have been pardoned were white, and this guy isn't. And, given what this president has said, just most recently about Somalis, it seems inconsistent with this president's values.
Yeah, well, there it is from counsel.
How do I, as a member of the public, anybody else, understand, again, these wildly divergent statements that are falling on partisan lines about something that is so gravely serious?
Well, as a former Secretary of Defense, I'm very concerned that the Republicans and the Democrats in the Congress are not coming together to look at this situation and determine what happened. This is serious. We've deployed almost 15,000 of our young men and women into harm's way. They're putting their lives on the line right now. And we don't know at this point just exactly what the objective is, whether or not we are really abiding by the law. What is the strategy? I think it's really important for Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill to come together on behalf of the American people to properly define just exactly what the hell is going on.
What would stop them from releasing this video? We've seen the other strikes we'll play you video of the strikes right now. We've seen a number of the 22 different strikes on drug boats, including this one. This is the first strike on September 2nd. The Pentagon has been quick to release all this video. Why would they not release the second strike?
Well, there is no justification for withholding the video on this strike. I think Senator Rand Paul is exactly right, that it ought to be released. And then the American people can make a judgment as to whether or not this was a war crime or something different.
What does it say about trust right now in our lawmakers? How does the American public look to the government and say to either party, I can trust you, when they can't form an agreement based on what they've seen with their own eyes?
You know, I tell the students at the Panetta Institute that in our democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there and willing to make tough decisions and to govern our country, then we can avoid crisis. But otherwise, we'll be governing by crisis. And I'm afraid right now there is a serious absence of leadership that should be stepping up in both parties, stepping up and saying, we have a responsibility here to our men and women in uniform to make sure that this country is clear about what is the objective, what are we doing, what's the strategy, what is the law, are we abiding by the law? Because you don't put our men and women in harm's way and then not be clear about what the objective is.
Secretary Panetta, let me play Mark Warner, the ranking member of Senate Intel, on what he saw and the disagreement with Senator Cotton.
I have a very different judgment than Senator Cotton, but I am not going to reach, a full conclusion until I get all the facts. I think Americans, it will be a chilling and extraordinarily disturbing video. And, this was a classified briefing, so the details, but I don't think there was, I don't think I'm going beyond any barrier to say there was no doubt about their gender. There was no doubt about the fact that I believe they were incapacitated.
There's also this secretary from the New York Times just came out a moment ago. According to folks who saw the video, some of the people viewing the video thought the waving by the survivors could have been an attempt to surrender. Others who viewed the video said the most logical explanation was that the two survivors had seen the American aircraft above them and started signaling for a rescue. So what this Times article says is that the two survivors were waving, and apparently it appears potentially waving at the aircraft above them for help. Is there, even in the fog of war, I'm trying to understand if there's any defense here, if there's any explanation for striking two survivors who are waving. It appears some of the Republicans are saying that they might have been signaling to another boat to come get them. You'd understand that if you were stuck in the water, I guess. Or maybe that they were trying to overturn the boat to get drugs back on, according to other Republicans. From that description, as somebody who's been at the head of this department, who's made complicated decisions under a lot of pressure, help me understand what could have been going through that admiral's head.
Well, first of all, let me say this. Secretary of Defense is involved in planning this military strike. And as Secretary of Defense, when we planned a military strike, I was present for the entire mission to be able to determine whether or not the mission is being properly accomplished. I'm not sure I understand why the Secretary of Defense witnessed the first strike, but then left the room and was not there for the second strike. And let me also say that whether he was there or not, it's the Secretary of Defense that should take responsibility for what happened here. Because that was an important call as to what should happen. And somehow the decision was made to kill the 2 survivors. And the reality is that after that, there were strikes that were made in which survivors were not killed, but were actually captured and returned back to their country. So something happened here in terms of the directions that were given to the military involved in these strikes. And I think it's important for the country to find out why those changes were made.
You know, Secretary, I've had you on a lot. I think this is correct me if I'm wrong, this is the angriest I've heard you. Why does this, am I hearing anger correctly? And if so, why? Why does this make you angry?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So it sounds like, and we've had you on so many times, this sounds to me the angriest that I have heard you in an interview, honestly. And I wonder, am I correct to state that you're angry, number one? And number two, if so, why would you be so angry?
I'm angry because this involves the lives of our men and women in uniform. Look, we have the strongest military on the face of the earth, and we have very brave men and women who have stepped up to be able to defend this country. And we've now deployed them to an area where we're not sure what exactly the mission is going to be. What's the objective? What's going to take place? And at the same time, we're striking these boats, and it's also not clear what is the intelligence, what is the planning that goes into it, what is the information involved. You know, we're playing with people's lives here. And very frankly, one of the strengths of our military is that we do respect life. We do respect that there are those, even in the heat of battle, who have to be protected because they're living human beings. So this is an issue that involves our fundamental values. This is an issue that involves how we are treating our men and women in uniform and whether we're giving them clear direction. And it involves, very frankly, whether or not the United States represents the kind of country that says we need to respect individuals, we need to respect the law, and we need to do what's right. That's what the United States of America is all about. So it's because those things are not being attended to that I'm concerned, because I think America is better than that.
One of the other aspects of this that I'm trying to understand, and I'm wondering if you have a better explanation for me, is after this second September 2nd strike, where the 2 survivors were killed, the protocol for what to do with survivors changed from the Pentagon, and there have been 2 others that we know of, and those 2, instead of being brought to the U.S. for trial for drug trafficking, which is what the Pentagon alleges they've been doing, they were repatriated. Would there be a reason for repatriation instead of extradition to the U.S. For trial if they were drug traffickers?
I'm not sure what the rationale was there, because if they are drug traffickers, they're breaking the law. They should have been arrested. They should have been brought to justice and tried. And somehow the decision was made to simply repatriate them back to their country. I think there's been a lot of confusion that has come up between the difference between enforcing the law and conducting a military war. And the reality is that we have always treated drug trafficking as a crime and have used our law enforcement and the Coast Guard to be able to go after these ships and find out what's on board, arrest them, and try them for any crimes that they've committed. Somehow, that standard of how we approach these issues has changed. And I'm not sure where it's taking us. If we're going to treat drug traffickers as enemy combatants, and that's the rationale that is being used now, then you have to ask the question, is the United States going to start bombing people in Colombia, in Honduras, in Mexico, because they're drug traffickers? Are they now enemy combatants who are going to get killed by the United States? That's a question we've all got to ask ourselves.